The following episode was originally recorded for a private podcast as part of the Equipped for Life course. It has been edited for public release, but may reference training material from the Equipped for Life course.
So when Tim and I were first thinking about the Equipped for Life course podcast, I had this idea of something I was really excited about that we've never done before. It's been
coming up on 2 years.
Almost 2 years. The idea was like, instead of only when we do kind of like listener mail type episodes, instead of just reading emails sent to us, and like I remember like even back on like Life Report back in the day, like I'd have the paper printed out and I'm like wrinkling them up to do like what every radio show does when they get emails. We're like, I got an email from Australia, like that whole thing. It didn't sound quite that corny, but it was half that corny. And it was like, instead of just doing that, what if we made it, especially if we have our own little studio space that we can just kind of jump into whenever. What if sometimes when people had really good but like kind of difficult questions where we might not fully understand their question, or maybe they're telling a story, hey, I just had an outreach, I just talked to this person and then they said this and I didn't know what to say. It's like we might not fully understand like enough of the context. So what if we brought the people asking the questions onto the show, and we can actually, instead of them just saying, hey, here's my question real quick, and then we like hang up on them and then like answer the question, like actually have like a back and forth, like, okay, like tell us more about that dialogue that you had at the outreach and what seemed to be going on for that person, and try to understand, and maybe even like role play back and forth. So this was always part of the original vision. Yep. And then I think what happened was a couple of things. One, a lot of the emails that we were getting, I didn't feel like fit really well into that idea. They were, like not bad questions, but relatively simple questions. Kind of like, I totally get what the person's saying and we can just kind of do it. And
or maybe sometimes like the questions themselves were well explained enough that like we didn't need the additional information.
Some of our questions we've got like 5 paragraph long like emails that where I'm trying to figure out like, all right, how much of this can I cut out for the show? But like we can understand what's going on. Yeah. And it's just easier to do it without bringing other people on. Like there's a logistical, complicatedness of what we've done this morning with Ian. But
logistical complicatedness.
Yeah, that's a new word. That should have been a word a long time ago, and now it's a word. So anyway, now we're doing that for the first time. So we've got Ian on, who is this is the very first time we've ever actually done this. We've had other people on the show before. We interviewed.
Lori Navratsky.
Yeah.
I interviewed her. Mm-hmm.
And I had interviewed the
Maddox.
Doctor, or the doctor from the
abortion pill reversal
thing. And we've brought Jacob on a lot of times because he's from Georgia and he's too far away to be in here in studio sometimes. But as far as bringing in someone, like Ian emailed us a set of amazing questions. It was like, here's a bunch of things that I'd like to talk about on the show. What?
Yeah, Ian's our first student on.
Ian's
I'm
the first
really
student
about
on.
that. I think that's great.
Yeah.
So maybe we'll do this more often. If you're interested in coming on, I'm interested in doing this more often. I think this will be really cool. So Ian, let's get to know Ian a little bit before we get into the questions. He's got really deep questions. This might be a 2-parter, maybe 3-parter. We'll see. But Ian is the president of Dukes for Life. And Ian, why don't you just kind of, everyone kind of knows who we are. So why don't you kind of introduce yourself to people, give them your pro-life history. What do you study in school? Give us some background on you.
Yeah, so like Josh said, I go to James Madison University, president of Dukes for Life there. I'm also interning with Feminists for Life currently. Started being pro-life sophomore year of high school, or more like junior year. I got really interested in the movement in high school. I actually did a large, called it baby supplies drive. It's the only thing we had, and got like 100 care packages for mothers in the area. And I guess now I've just been doing research for like 3-4 years, just trying to understand it. And I think that's my pro-life background in a summary.
Wow. What kind of research have you been doing?
Lots of podcasts, lots of Google. I like listening to things more than I like reading them, which is kind of bad. Really wish I was a better reader.
It makes you and like everybody else right now.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And then we met you at the Students for Life conference a couple of years ago, right?
No, the first time I ever met you was this past conference, actually.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, you were in the room giving the bodily rights argument. I think it was just, it was sovereign zone and rights to refuse arguments.
I was responding to the bodily rights.
Responding. You weren't giving them.
Just like everyone should be pro-choice here because of bodily autonomy, you goofy. Yeah.
He's been a plant.
No, I think they're brilliant, though.
Time.
Yeah, I think your bodily rights arguments are like some of the best arguments you guys have ever. Counter arguments.
Right.
I
Keep doing that.
Amazing. I first heard them.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And what's your major, and what is your club up to this year? I want to hear a little bit about that.
So my major is I'm justice studies. I'm kind of right now I can either go global justice, which is more like an ethical approach to the world, or I can go social justice. I'm more interested in human rights. I don't know how much I like the social justice at my college in particular. I feel like they won't really like me, but always be in the minority.
Shocking.
But beside, and then my club this year. So right now, Dukes for Life. I'm reviving the club. It was a little bit crazy my freshman year. I was like, hey, I want to be involved with the club. Oh, cool. We have like 6 people. I came from a club that had like 60. And so I'm like, oh, like 60? And they're like, nah, like 6. And I never saw any of the 6. I saw one of the 6 people. Wow. And then the club just kind of got passed on to me as the year progressed. So our first big year is we're going to be working with Feminists for Life on some pregnancy resource forum, which is a big thing. Our 2 goals are that we want to open up a dialogue on our campus about topics of abortion. Just have people being able to talk in an open environment, and also to get resources and work with a medical nonprofit in the area that helps out mothers and unintended pregnancies. So those are 2 main things we're doing this year. I'm totally down for a Pie the Pro-Lifer Day, where I just want to set up in like an area and just say, hey, you guys can pie us, and the only condition is 1, you don't hurt us, and 2, you sit down, have a short dialogue with us, however long you want, about why you're pro-choice.
That's interesting.
And it attracts pro-lifers and pro-choicers. Yeah.
Okay, so this is the first time I've heard this outreach idea. So I'm thinking out loud. So I got like a couple of questions. So like off the top of my head, like, do they pie you first or after the dialogue?
Oh, first, of course.
Okay, good.
It's if they walk away, then they look like jerks. That's kind of it.
Okay, so I still don't understand. They pie you first, and then you have the dialogue?
It's not.
Yes, 100%.
So do you wipe the whipped cream like off your face first, or like are you just like there with like?
Well, I'm picturing. Well, we've never done this before, and this is like an idea I'm still presenting to the club. They're a little bit hesitant on it.
Yeah,
I'm open.
It wouldn't be a full pie. It would just be Cool Whip on the thing, and you would just have like a little like bib thing on, and we'd have paper towels. And for the vice president, we'd have like gluten-free whipped cream or whatever it is. He's like gluten-free or something for some of them. And they would go and they would just pie us in the face. We wipe it off, say, hi, my name's Ian, or something like that. Or they would choose who they want to pie. That's kind of how I'm envisioning it. I don't know. I feel like it'd be a fun thing. It'd definitely be a picture moment.
Yeah, I'm definitely interested in you getting back to me and telling me about the results of the outreach. I'm interested. We're always interested. We're always interested in things. Like if that works, that's good to know. I could see it backfiring. I could see it having this effect where people are like, it's harder for them to take your philosophical ideas seriously if you've got like whipped cream on your shirt and stuff in your hair. But I don't know. Maybe I'm just wrong. I don't know.
My gut is that it'll work. That's my gut. Because it has like an entertainment value. It cuts the tension, and I think it's the kind of thing that has stopping power. Like in theory, like I've been so wrong about outreach stuff before.
Yeah. Well, I think with what Josh is saying, or Tim's saying, it's kind of like it could backfire with them not taking you seriously, but also cuts attention. So even if they don't take you as seriously as you talk to them and open up with them, they won't want to yell at you because they just pied you in the face, and they won't get angry. Calm down. That's the thought when I first introduced by this. Like I said, this wasn't my original idea.
They just got their anger out of their system.
And you're in the role of the person who's just been attacked. So you can't be like, you're trying to hurt women as easily because you're in this passive receiving the hatred role already. I think there's something to it. I could completely backfire. I could imagine this being the best outreach idea ever or the worst ever.
It's not going to be our first. It won't be our first. We're going to do one outreach, and then we'll try the Pie the Pro-Lifer Day. Like, probably.
Yeah, please let us know.
Spring.
That's so cool.
100%.
I'm interested. So you sent us a whole bunch of questions, although there's like one that was very kind of quick and light before all the deep stuff. So let's go there first. You were asking something along the lines of like, how long do our conversations go or something?
Oh, yeah. I've had like 9 or 10 conversations ever since I started like using the techniques you guys talk about. And the shortest has been 45 minutes. And both times it's just because it got cut. No, first one I ever did was 45 minutes and actually worked like a charm.
That's great.
And then besides that, that's the shortest my dialogues have ever been. They're always 45 minutes plus. One of them was an hour and a half. So how long did they take you guys? Because that just feels like it's insanely long. They're super effective when they get that long. But yeah, what do you think?
I think it's the longer the conversation, oftentimes the better. Like I've had conversations that go a long time, and we're kind of spinning our wheels, and like it's not actually being that productive. But like, if I were to rank my top 20 most like impactful conversations, they're all long because it takes time. It gives you time to build rapport, and people are more responsive when you have some rapport. And it gives you time to like slowly and carefully work through these different issues. Like changing someone's viewpoint on a subject like this doesn't usually happen in 5 minutes. And so like if it goes an hour, that's awesome. Like my favorite conversations every outreach we do are the long ones.
Yep.
But I certainly have a lot of shorter ones because either they're not interested enough or they've got class or who knows what. But like I love the long ones.
Yeah, and I think people are certainly worth investing in, and I'd rather talk to one person for 2 hours than 10 people in the same time, because it really is about the more time you have with them, the more things you can explore and respond to. And the 5-minute conversations are the ones that you're always disappointed that they have to go.
Yeah.
And so
you've built a little rapport, and that's it. It's not like people walk up with only one objection to the pro-life, position or something like that. So, yeah, I feel like the same way. I feel like if I've had like 1,000 or so conversations, I'm sure I've had lots that were in the 5 to 15-minute range because they couldn't stick around for long. But I feel like like the best ones I've had a lot that were 30, 45 plus minutes. So that happens, and those are the best.
Yeah, can I ask, it's just because we just built off the previous topic, maybe just like one response from one of you?
Yeah.
Because I really am curious about this. And then we'll get to the really deep philosophical stuff, because this is still a little bit later. Warm up, it's only like 9:55. I woke up like an hour ago. Let's just the brain rolling.
Fair enough.
Yeah. So what's your view on how your approach to dialogue? Like in your own words, how would you describe the Equal Rights Institute's like approach to dialogue with people and like just laying it out? What do you think?
So I think like a lot of our view of dialogue has to do with like how can you create an environment in the conversation where it kind of feels like there's a couple of buddies hanging out at Starbucks having coffee and talking as friends, and it's not like very different from Trump and Clinton behind podiums. And so I think our dialogue approach involves a lot of thinking about how do you make the person feel emotionally safe in the dialogue, that they feel like they're safe to change their mind and you're not going to make fun of them, that they're being really actually heard, that they feel that you're open-minded, and then that you've got really good responses to their arguments. And in those responses, it shows that you actually understand where they're coming from. And are responding to not like the lamest version, but a pretty strong version of it. So I think that's how I would summarize a lot of our dialogue approach. But do you guys want to jump in and kind of add to that?
Sure. I think so. The concept of emotional safety is pretty strong in my mind in terms of how we think about dialogue. So I might say something like, you can win arguments without the other person feeling emotionally safe, but you can't persuade people. And we're not in the business of trying to just win arguments. We want to persuade people. Lives are on the line. And so we have to think about not just what arguments are we making, but how are we making them, and how does the other person feel? And like we're not just like singing Kumbaya together. Like it's not just a matter of like trying to have a happy time. But people do not change their mind when they're in combat mode, when they're in fight mode. And so we got to try to figure out how to help them lower their shields, build some rapport, and have a real conversation instead of just having the on the surface, well, here's my sound bites going back and forth, and we've each got our sound bites. But if all we're doing is exchanging sound bites, nothing's going to happen. I want to persuade them, so we got to get the tension down, have a real conversation.
For me, a lot of times it's very personal, and I try to look at that other person and ask myself, what do they need? And what kind of person do they want to be? And how can I show them that they can be the person they want to be and be pro-life? I think a lot of times people are pro-choice because they want to be and because of things they've heard. And so I'm trying to expose them to the truth in a different way than they've had it presented before. And so every conversation is very different, but every conversation has some sort of combination of this like loving approach and this logical approach. And I think that many times, unfortunately, people think that they don't work together when they totally do. And they have to work together if they're going to change their mind.
Do you have this automatic thing where you want to also go, and every conversation is also a series of difficult judgment calls and Miss Prayer without ceasing? Like you keep on using the phrase every conversation is, and I'm like, I know what's coming, and then you went a different direction. Occasionally. Just been trained in that.
Open-minded, like all of our catchphrases.
Does that help?
Yeah, that was actually Rachel's quote. That was amazing. The quote, I totally wrote that down. I was like, help them be the person that they want to be. Because that's kind of like what I feel like the essence is, like going through the dialogue and talking, just starting to talk to people. Not like you guys, as you guys have had thousands, but yeah, I think that was. Should I get to the philosophically?
Let's do it.
Let's
jump into the deep end of the pool together.
To this.
Awesome. So I actually had a conversation. Okay, brief question that gets us into it. Then the really heavy hitting question, because I'm reading right from my email and I'm realizing I should start with this. Is it intellectually honest to start with one conclusion to bring us to another? So basically, what I'm going with that is in the personhood argument. We're basically starting with the conclusion you can't kill infants, which I think should be self-evident. But there's still reason we should justify it because everything's on the line, especially with the example Tim brought up in a recent podcast of like helping someone create a whole new society. And now we have to decide what should all the rules be. And we can't just say, oh, infants, because that's what we've done in the past. Like we have to have a reason to keep them alive. Gosh, that sounds so wrong. I hate this open to it. I'm trying to force myself to be open. Yeah. So does that make sense? Is it hard? It's hard to start with the conclusion of infants. That's saying, okay, because infants don't have these characteristics that other things do, and we must want to keep infants alive. We have to keep embryos and fetuses alive.
Right. That's
like a really quick summation of it. So what's your thoughts on starting with a conclusion?
So I want to make sure that I'm understanding your question because there's a couple of different things you might mean here, and I want to make sure before I go on like a long rant,
Perfect.
Trying to answer the question. So it sounds like where you're going is something like someone could just say, "How do you know it's wrong to kill infants?" And so the first premise of the argument is on shaky ground. Is that something like in the right direction?
That's basically it, because it's hard to convince someone it's a person if they don't view the infants as a person. It's hard that I'm saying I'm being completely intellectually honest when I'm starting with the premise that I can justify, but I don't feel like I can justify it well enough right now. Yeah. Like I feel like I need to have more nuance to it. And I definitely don't think it's a hard thing to say, I don't think we should kill infants, because I genuinely don't, but it's hard to get into that. So so does that clear it up?
Yes, that's really helpful.
Okay. Yeah.
Okay, so the first thing that I want to say is that the discussion that we're about to have is we're going to dig down into the weeds, but almost no conversation about abortion, like with an actual pro-choice person, has to get down into these weeds. So brace yourself. Okay. It's gonna get a little bit messy here, but that's okay, and don't let it scare you because it's almost never useful. So there's a thing that I used to do in my earlier pro-life advocate days, back when I worked for Justice for All, where someone would question something like, well, maybe it's not wrong to kill animals, or maybe it is just as wrong to kill animals, or maybe it's not wrong to kill infants, or some other thing they would push against one of the thought experiments and say, well, who knows? And I would be like, well, let's talk about how we know things. Get into this whole epistemology discussion. That's a little bit of an exaggeration.
I could totally see you doing that, though.
It's an exaggeration. It's a more fluid process. But we would wind up having this discussion about, like, okay, well, how do we know these bedrock things? And in my mind at the time, this seemed like the most helpful way to go, because they're asking this question. They're asking how we know. And the problem is, it didn't work very well. Like, I feel like I'm pretty good at this kind of discussion. But what would very consistently happen is we would just go back and forth and play advanced chess together, and then like no change of mind would happen. At least I didn't get the impression that there was any change of mind. You never really know, but that wasn't my read. And they would walk away, and it eats up a lot of time. It's a long discussion. And so I figured out a workaround for the everyday conversation. I'm not going to do it with you because we're gonna dig into the weeds, but I want to be really, really clear for any listeners that you don't have to do this almost ever. I wrote about this workaround in a blog post called "Circumventing Philosophy Hell," which is one of my more dramatic blog post titles. And it's because I like this getting into the weeds conversation when you've got maybe an hour. If you're lucky, it's not the best use of your hour. And so basically the approach is, if they say something like, well, I don't know, some people think that killing newborns is okay. Just instead of making the claim, I have knowledge that it's wrong to kill newborns, I say, well, just be consistent. Do you think it's wrong to kill newborns? And they're like, yeah. And okay, well, move on. So here's the key. I don't have to prove in most conversations that I have knowledge. Knowledge is a critical word here. Knowledge that it's wrong to kill newborns. We can just say, well, we all agree with that. And so what else should we take from that? These are all premises that we accept already. And so I don't have to dig into the weeds with them. I had this conversation at one of our last outreaches where this guy did this multiple times in one conversation. So I think we were on bodily rights at one point, and it's talked about thalidomide. It's like, well, I don't know. Some people might think it's that's okay. And they're like, yeah, but to you? Nah. We just moved on. And then we ended up on Person later. It's like, well, some people are really into animal rights. Yeah, but like, do you think that it's really the same thing to kill a squirrel as it is to kill a human? No. Okay, so then you just need to be consistent. Given that you already believe that, this is kind of what you're stuck with. Here are your options. And so that's the approach that I take in my conversations. I don't dig into the weeds. It's really, really important for me. In general, the conversation that we're going to have here is not what you need to have. Occasionally it is, because occasionally someone does want to know more. And even if you never talk to one of those, it's good for us to have a better understanding of what our kind of foundation is here. So I really appreciate the question, but that's where I wanted to start. So given that, I think a lot of the discussion here has to do with how trustworthy our intuitions are. And this is just a really tough discussion for a couple of reasons. One of them is intuitions are somewhat unreliable things.
Yep.
Like for multiple reasons. Mm-hmm. The skeptic in this conversation kind of has like the high ground. I've got the high ground, Anakin, because what the skeptic is doing is he's arguing that intuitions are kind of weak. And so how can you be so trustworthy of intuitions? And the problem is, I don't think the skeptic actually has the high ground, but the attacker has the high ground. In a discussion between different epistemological views, and by epistemology, I mean like discussions about what we know, how we know things. There are views like mine that say we can know things, and we can know some of those things through intuition, at least sometimes. One of the alternative views is to be the extreme skeptic, and you say, no, intuition sucks. Here's all the reasons intuition sucks. And they're right. There are a lot of reasons intuition sucks. But the overall view of extreme skepticism is less reasonable than the overall view of something like mine. But whichever one of us is talking has the stronger position. So think about a board game like Risk. Have you ever played Risk? My friends and I used to play Risk for just like hours. We would like spend an hour doing diplomacy before making moves. It was a lot of fun. One of the things about Risk, if you've never played Risk, is there are mechanics in the game where you're rolling the dice against each other, and the defender has a certain kind of advantage, which is if you roll the dice and one person rolls higher than the other, then they win that roll. But what if you roll the same roll? You both roll 5s. Well, then the defender gets the win. The defender has an inherent advantage in that structure of the game. And what I'm saying is, I think that when it comes to these epistemology discussions, whoever is on offense has the advantage. Because it's really easy to tear down an epistemological view, because epistemological views are very, very innately hard to prove. So think about the kinds of things that people say like as rhetorical moves in an argument. They'd be like, oh yeah, well, prove it. Like if you say, yeah, well, prove it, you've gained some position, because man, it's hard to prove things. And so the other person's kind of on their back foot. It's cheating. It's just rhetorical cheating to do that, because like by prove it, it kind of implies, well, you've got to try to get to certainty or something. And it's really hard to get to certainty. Or another example would be like, well, how do you know for sure? How do you know for sure? I can be like, well, I think that Lincoln was the president of the United States at one point in history. Well, how do you know for sure? Like the person who's on the attack in an epistemology discussion always kind of has a rhetorical edge. Yeah. And so the reason I say this is we can't just spend time letting the skeptic beat us up on intuition. We've got to spend time talking about the skeptic's view, which is way worse. And that's fair. So another analogy would be discussions between Calvinists and Arminians. Not going to state a position on that discussion right now, but there's a dynamic that I've noticed a lot in these discussions where if you focus on just one Bible passage, it gives a lot of advantage to one side or the other. So if you just read Romans 9, you're like, all right, we're going to have an all-out brawl between a Calvinist and Arminian. But the rules of the debate are we only talk about Romans 9. That's kind of unfair. The Calvinist is going to win the argument.
Kind of?
Yeah. But on the other hand, if you change the game and you say, no, we're only going to look at, say, 1 Timothy, or maybe the book of Hebrews, and that's the only area where we can talk about scripture, then the Arminian, in my opinion, is going to win that debate. And so a fair discussion between these theological views is one that takes all of these verses into account. You say, okay, this verse seems to imply some plausibility for Calvinism. This one seems to imply some plausibility for Arminianism. But which one is more plausible? You have to look at both sides of the discussion together. And so if all you're doing is you're saying, well, man, intuition sucks. Look at all the ways that it's unreliable. And you don't look at the alternative epistemological system, you've stacked the deck against the view that says intuition's okay. Because here's what the world looks like if you go along like all the way with the arguments against intuition. You say, well, I guess intuition's garbage. All right, well, what do we have left then? What do you know? Do you love your mom? Like, are you sure? I don't know. I guess not. What did you do yesterday? Like, what you did yesterday is based on your memory. How reliable is your memory? Like, if you apply that same standard to everything and you play fair, both sides get to interrogate each other just as hard. What you wind up with is the extreme skeptic has nothing to work with. And so what that means is that sometimes an extreme skeptic is like, well, I'm just gonna live with it and be like, yeah, you're right. I don't know anything. But they still turn doorknobs when they want to get somewhere. Like, they still kind of act like they have knowledge. They still act like they have good reason to trust people that are close to them. Like, the extreme skeptic doesn't actually live that way.
This is as a quick story. So I had this really annoying conversation with a solipsist one time at
which is
so he doesn't. Well, I think you're going to give a more accurate definition of what it is. So
Sure.
I'll let you accurately define it. I know this what he was.
The
He defined
solipsist
himself.
believes he's the only mind that exists. Everything else is he's imagining other people that are talking to him.
Yeah. And
it's impossible to prove them wrong.
I found that out.
It's so stupid, but it's impossible to prove them wrong.
I had never met one before. This was a brand new experience for me. I never even heard of this view before.
Obnoxious.
This was like 5 or 6 years ago or something like that. So I'm on like this college campus and I'm like, wait a minute, like you basically think you're like Neo in the Matrix, like you're plugged in still, but you're the only thing like or how does this work?
There's no other minds. Everyone else is a machine.
He's like, I don't believe anything. Like I'm so free, and smart, because I don't believe. And I'm like, what about like this tree right here? Like, do you believe this tree exists? He's like, no, it's just like it's in my mind. And I'm like, run into it then. Like I'm touching it. Like you're the smart one in this debate. Like that's not what I said. But
that's not.
I gave up pretty quick.
It's not an unreasonable response. Like, it's a pretty snarky thing to say, but like it's always it's like when you're in an intro to philosophy class.
Yeah.
Like there's always one kid in the back of the class who's like, well, how do we know really? Like, ooh, isn't that clever? No, it's really not. It doesn't take anything clever to be like, well, how do we know? And so there's some of the snark that you expressed towards the solipsist, I think is actually pretty appropriate.
It's all what was in my head. I graciously ended it just because it's like, if you don't believe anything, then I can't get you to believe anything. And so I don't know why we're having this conversation.
But if you're arguing with the solipsist on unfair turf and all that they say is, well, you have to prove my view wrong, then you're going to lose the argument because you can't prove that another mind exists. So the terms of the discussion have to be fair. And my view is that, yes, intuition is sketchy. Sometimes it seems pretty good. Sometimes it doesn't seem pretty good. And so we got a problem with it. Let's put that problem to the side. But the alternative, if we throw it out entirely, then we end up with just this stupid view that no one actually has. No one actually believes they don't know anything. Another problem that's in this discussion is people equate knowledge with certainty. I'm not saying that I have certainty of everything. I'm not saying that I know my wife is in California. She's on a trip. She's visiting a friend for a funeral. I've got really good reasons to believe she's in California. Like, we've FaceTimed. Like, I recognize her parents' house where she was staying the other day. Like, I got really good reason to believe she's in California.
But how do you know?
Is it possible?
Maybe she's in the same soundstage where they faked the moon landing.
Exactly.
Like, with the fake background and green screen
I
stuff.
guess that's possible. I think I have knowledge that my wife is in California right now. And that means that the whole approach of throwing out intuition altogether is a dumb approach. I still have knowledge, even though I don't have certainty of where my wife is. So given that, what should we do about this huge problem of intuition? Because the skeptics' arguments against intuition, at least some of them, still stand.
Do you want to do one? I felt like you might want to go one step before you jump to intuition,
Sure.
which is just like, since you said that knowledge isn't certainty, do you want to explain what you think knowledge is? You want to get into justified true belief?
So knowledge isn't certainty, but what is knowledge? Well, that's a whole complicated, like huge question in the epistemological world itself. I think that what knowledge is something like justified true belief. So in order for it to be knowledge, you have to have these three things, but this is also an imperfect definition, because a guy called Gettier figured out a few decades ago that there are examples of things where you have justified true belief, but they seem pretty obviously not to be knowledge. How do we know that they're not knowledge? Well, it's intuition. If you throw out intuition, you also throw out all of epistemology. It's all gone. And so given that, I've got to give the caveat, knowledge is something like justified true belief. It has to be true. If I say, well, I know that we didn't land on the moon, and we actually did land on the moon, then that's not something that I know. It might be something that I believe, but it's not knowledge. It has to be justified. If I believe that my wife is holding her hand up in the air right now in California, I've got no way to know that. And it just happens to be I'm lucky and she is. That's not knowledge. So it can't just be a true belief. I have to have a justification for it too. And so that doesn't mean it's certain, but you've got to have justification for believing it, and it has to be true. Something like that is what knowledge is. It's not certainty. And that makes more sense of how we actually live our lives. Like, we have to function in a way where we treat things as knowledge. Let's dip for a second into the moral world. So a skeptic could say, well, maybe I've got to function by kind of pretending that I know that doorknobs turn and open doors. But, well, how do you know about moral questions? Like, you're trying to outlaw abortion. That seems awfully oppressive. Okay, well, at a moral level, how do we function as an extreme skeptic? We've got to be complete anarchists. We can't outlaw sex slavery or murder or theft or rape or anything. We can't outlaw these things because we don't know. And come on, we know. Can you make some kind of an argument that we're wrong? Sure. So I'll say we aren't certain, but we know, and it's okay to act on these things. So given that we're going to hold both of these views at the same time, my view is way better than the extreme skeptic view. That's my position anyway, hence I have this view. But if you just want to cross-examine me on intuition and explain why that there are problems, well, I'm kind of on the back foot. But given that we've got to trust them at least at some level, what then should we do to try to be as reasonable as we can? Well, we've got to pay attention to the kinds of things that make our intuitions unreliable. So for instance, if you're taking certain kinds of medication, you should trust your intuitions less, because the medications affect your brain and affects your processing, and you become less reliable. So someone that I know not too long ago was on pretty serious medications, and he was asked what he had for dinner, and he gave that day, what he had for dinner that day, hours before, and he gave a completely different answer to what he actually had. His memory, as one of the forms of intuition, became unreliable for this time while he was on this medication. Okay, so if you end up on medication, you should be less trustworthy of your intuitions. If you get diagnosed with Alzheimer's, then you should probably get into a mental place of being a little more trusting. Like, at some level in the way that we function, we have a certain level of kind of protectiveness that's based on distrust. Maybe someone's going to take advantage of me. But if you know that you have Alzheimer's, you have to kind of be a little more open to being taken advantage of, because you just can't function unless you trust other people, because your intuitions, your memories are not going to be reliable ones. There'll be a couple of examples. And so all of these things affect how we should think about given intuitions. And so in terms of the moral world, there's going to be certain things that I'm going to believe morally, but I'm going to take less seriously. So your original question was something like, is it fair to start with your conclusion? And my answer is sometimes yes and sometimes no. So if someone wants to start with the conclusion, fetuses are in, well, so we'll just start there. The start of my argument is fetuses are in, therefore abortion is wrong. I think they're begging the question. Functionally, it's a circular argument. I don't think that my intuition, I'm open to you pushing back by on your intuition, but my intuition towards fetuses is not, in my opinion, strong enough or clear enough that I should just trust it as being definitely true. My intuition that it's wrong to torture babies for fun is strong enough that I'm comfortable just calling it knowledge. So some things are going to be clearer than others. My intuition that when I run over a squirrel, it's just a different universe of a kind of incident than if I were to run over a toddler is about as strong as it can be. And so given that, I'm comfortable treating it as knowledge. I could be wrong. It could be that It's like logically possible that squirrels are incredibly precious, valuable things. And like the Bible verse about that is just like, lost to history or something. We could go weird directions
all
with
the
these
squirrels are like in the universe of Emperor's New Groove. Like they're all cute.
Yeah,
and they
or
have this little
something like that.
language with each other.
But they don't communicate
and we're running
that to
them
us.
over all the time.
We don't seem to have good reason to believe that they're persons. And so hence my intuition is what it is. And so I think it's fair to start with really extreme clear things. It's okay to start with, well, rape is wrong, and let's take that as a given and then move on from there. It's not okay to start with, well, republicanism is just true. Or capitalism is the best. Like, you got to make arguments for these things. Very, very basic, very, very clear moral things. I think it is okay to start with and take those moral truths to learn about the more complicated things. So the fact that we know that it's wrong to kill infants and that it's less wrong to kill animals gives us information to then try to answer the harder question about whether or not it's wrong to kill fetuses.
Okay. So kind of delving into what you just said, when you're actually talking to someone and maybe the subject comes up like a skeptic, first we approach you like, is that what you believe? Just kind of get, is this what you really believe? And then if that is what they believe, would you then, from what I'm kind of hearing, try to ask some questions and hear about their worldview and see if their worldview is consistent enough? Is that about your approach you would take?
Sure. So if I meet an extreme skeptic on campus, we're talking about abortion, like, you don't know that it's wrong to kill newborns, like, you don't know anything, then what I'm going to do in that conversation is try to see if there's a workaround. So another possible workaround is they think that we don't know that it's wrong, but they have some kind of an ad hoc system for why we should have certain laws. Well, they'll be like, well, society is more stable if we outlaw murder, even though we don't know if it's wrong to outlaw murder. Like, if they've got something like that in place, then maybe I can work around it. Maybe. I mean, even that is sketchy. But there's certain conversations where you can find the workaround. But if I can't find any kind of workaround that can rescue the conversation about abortion, and like basically in order to deal with abortion, we've got to deal with this deeper root issue. We got to go deeper root, and that's just the only option that we have. In which case, I'm going to push them hard on whether their skeptical system is a reasonable system. And a really, really, really committed skeptic is not a movable person. It's kind of like talking to an extreme relativist, which we've talked about before on a previous podcast. Like, if you're really committed and you're like, man, I guess that means that torturing babies is okay. Fine. You kind of like mentally commit to this. And so if someone asks you about it, like, yes, it's okay, because it's all relative. If you really dig into it, it's going to be hard to move you. But I think a lot of people kind of flirt with skepticism because they see the problems with things like intuition, and so they become kind of skeptical, and skepticism starts to seem more reasonable, and they haven't played it to its logical conclusion. So I want to play it to its logical conclusion, try to get them to see that the alternative is better, even though it has its flaws.
I want to ask a quick clarification question that I could imagine some audience members wondering, and then I want to let Rachel jump in because he had her hand up like 5 minutes ago.
Yep.
Just for you, though, because you were just talking about, we've talked about for years this idea that certain conversations is going to go deep enough, or there's some other kind of a root issue going on in our view, and this is different than some of our colleagues, but in our view, it's like you go for that thing. You talk about relativism, you talk about why infanticide is wrong, you talk about why utilitarianism is wrong.
If someone thinks infanticide isn't wrong, then you're not going to win on abortion until you win on infanticide first.
Embryos are just less obvious.
Yes.
So can you clarify, so as you kind of role-played a little bit with yourself, what you would do with the hardcore skeptic, like at some point you're just going to start asking him and try to show why his view is wrong. Can you contrast that with what you said past Tim used to do a long time ago, which was kind of, how do we know things?
Sure.
That sounds kind of similar, but I'm guessing what you do now is different than what you used to do. Can you just explain how those are different?
It is similar, but one is absolutely necessary and one is totally not absolutely necessary.
So you were jumping there too soon before, kind of a thing? Like you weren't circumventing philosophy hell before?
Previously, so what I was describing earlier, where I would be like, oh, well, how do we know things? I was jumping into an unnecessary philosophy hell conversation. Mm-hmm. Sometimes the only thing you can do is jump into philosophy hell, because that's where their soul is trapped. So you got to jump in there and try and pull them out. This has gotten in a weird
parallel.
Yeah.
Which circle of hell is this in Dante?
4. I don't know. And so if they're actually an extreme skeptic, there's nothing else you can do but philosophy hell.
Or give up.
If they're not, if they're like the person I was talking about at Davidson, and it's like, well, I don't know, some people think that animals should have those rights too, and you're like, yeah, but do you believe that? It's like, no. Okay, we don't have to talk about it because we already agree on the premise. Right. So don't get into unnecessary philosophy hell conversations. If they are actually a full-on extreme skeptic, that's just where we are in my view.
For most pro-life advocates, I think they're going to be too quick to take the person's word for it that they're like an extreme skeptic. And what I mean by that is I think what happens way more often than not is if someone's bringing up the, well, how do we know it's wrong to kill infants? How do we know it's wrong to torture babies for fun? I think they're going there even though they're not an extreme skeptic because they don't know where else to go. So this is like something they're
grasping for something.
They're grasping for the first time. And what I don't want the pro-life advocate to do is hear that and think, oh no, I ran into the 1 in a million extreme skeptic. No, you have
Test
not.
it.
Right. I'm going to be a little bit more stubborn with the person and I'm going to push back. And something that Ian kind of brought up, at a pragmatic level, this torturing babies for fun is wrong intuition is a shared intuition. That's why this is a persuasive argument. And so it is much more helpful to demonstrate that this is a shared intuition and that intuition exists and you share it, because this is a very fringe view to say we don't have intuition to rely on. And I think for most pro-life advocates, they're not going to be able to navigate through philosophy hell. And so I actually think it's going to be the best call for most people to, if you think that you actually have found the 1 in a million, to end the conversation. Because unless you're Tim, or unless you have,
I'm not the only one that can do this conversation, but unless you're ready for the conversation, I think that's true.
And most people are not, I think. Even those who think very well, it's just a place where you're probably not going to be very helpful for them. You're probably going to be swimming over your head and you don't want to go there.
That's plausible. But it's also like, if there's nobody else around, play around with it and learn and try to get better at thinking about it. Like there's still a learning opportunity there. But if you're at an event where there's a lot of possible other conversations, then the conversation that you're having with the extreme skeptic is conversations that you can't have with someone else. That's true.
Before Ian jumps back in, let me ask a clarification question, because like we're kind of in pragmatic mode, especially for, I feel like the listeners who have not taken a philosophy course. Rachel, I was kind of reading into like something that you might do with the moral skeptic, or you might encourage some people to do with the moral skeptic, but I just want to like completely make it explicit and then see, is this what you guys would recommend doing? Is this like a bad tool for people to try doing, or is this good? Which is obviously, we've heard Christian apologists bring up the idea of, torturing babies for fun is obviously wrong. This is kind of like the gold standard. Everybody knows this is wrong kind of a thing, to the point that a lot of atheists have heard the phrase already. But if you're talking to a moral skeptic, one direction you might be able to go is ask them, do you think torturing babies for fun is wrong? And when they say yes, just ask them, okay, how do you know that? Or is that unhelpful for some reason?
My personal style is I don't like to ask questions that people aren't going to be able to answer. And I think most people can't answer that question well. Most people can't tell you at an epistemological level why torturing babies for fun is wrong. They just know it through intuition. And
that's what I'm trying to expose, though.
That's what makes it a great question.
And that's what makes it a great question. But like, I feel sometimes when you do that in the conversation, they get frustrated, and it's like, that's an end game move. And I think sometimes this sort of obstacle is coming up earlier on. And so I don't like to use that as my first out. If they're like, infanticide is wrong, how do we know that? I like to be a little bit more stubborn with them and be like, why are you asking that question? Do you really want to like go there, or are you just trying to trick me? Or like, why are you bringing that up? Like, I take more of that personal style.
Yeah. So certainly, I think I agree, like that, like what your approach is going to be maybe probably less frustrating for them, so it might be the best like first move. But certainly, if I were to do this 2-part question thing, like I wouldn't actually do it so rat-a-tat-tat like what I just I would be very common ground. Like, hey, I don't want to, I don't like, I'm not making fun of you. I'm not like trying to trap you. I'm just like, I'm trying to understand your view better, and so you answering this question would give me would shed a lot of light on like what's going on for you. How is it that like I feel like I also know, we agree it's wrong to torture toddlers for fun. How do you know that though? Like, you're asking me questions about like, how do I know moral things? So I'm wondering, like, how would you say that you know this really obvious moral thing is wrong. Like that's a lot nicer, friendlier way to say it, and less likely to frustrate them, I think. But it might not be the first approach.
So I basically agree with both of you. So I think the important things that I feel like Rachel's bringing out, and if I'm putting words in your mouth, then you can correct me. But what I feel like you're bringing out is people don't like losing arguments, and so they start grasping at things. Mm-hmm. And like I could imagine a pro-life an ill-prepared pro-life advocate doing the same thing to the pro-choice person who brings up the violinist. They're like, yeah, well, how do we really know that that's our conclusion? I mean, it's just like a weak, lame, I'm looking for an excuse kind of a move for a lot of people. Whatever argument you're having, one thing you can do is play the skeptic game. Like, that's just how this works. And so if that's what they're doing, is they're being kind of immature people and they're just taking the skeptic way out, then I think, challenge that, see if that's really what they're doing. Is that really your view, or are you just trying to avoid losing an argument here? And why are we going here now? Is totally a fair move. But after testing, if they're doubling down on skepticism.
They bunker down, yeah.
I am perfectly happy to push them hard enough that either they're going to break or they're going to leave the conversation. Be nice. I mean, use good wisdom here. But a question like, it seems like your view means we can't know that torturing babies for fun is wrong. That seems obviously like that seems like a problem to me. Is that a problem for you? Like, that's totally fair game. And if they're cranky because their lame argument has just received this difficult challenge, then that's fine. I'm happy for them to, in that case, leave cranky, and that frees me up for probably a better conversation. And maybe the fact that I got them cranky, maybe they'll think about it more later. Like, it's such a difficult thing to pull off, shaking a skeptic like that. Like, I'm willing to make a riskier move.
When people start grasping at like skeptic straws, or they start biting big bullets, for me, I always am noticing it's because walls are up and I want to bring the walls down. And I think for some people, explain to me why rape is wrong could get you to a really good place. It could get you to a place where you're talking about, well, humans just have dignity. That's great. But sometimes I think if the walls are up enough for them to be like biting these bullets, I want to try to bring them down, and there's other moves I make first. And sometimes if the walls are up too much, you just can't have the conversation. You have to end it.
So, and I think I agree with that. Like don't go. Mm-hmm. So, well, I guess you don't think that torturing babies are fun or rape is wrong. Like that's not your first move. Mm-hmm. But after you spend some time, like, you've built the rapport, time to cash it in. Like, you got to push them hard. Mm-hmm. And I think that's one good way to push them hard.
Actually, it was so funny you said this when you did this. So we're jumping back like 5 minutes ago, I think.
We covered a lot of ground here.
Oh my gosh, yeah, this is great. But you mentioned that if you're and this is actually the same thing I thought of, so I wanted to hear your thoughts on it. You said if you're by yourself and you find someone who's kind of like really hunkering down, and if you were with other people, you'd probably end the conversation to have a new one. But if you're by yourself, you might delve deeper into, I guess, this little hell this philosophical hell. How would you approach going into like philosophical hell with someone when you have that extra time too? Like, sure. How would you do it so you don't shut down the conversation, frustrate them too much, and you get to delve into their ideas?
Sure. So that's a good question. So to be clear, that the timing here is, like, even if it's me and I feel like I can do this conversation pretty well, mm-hmm. Usually I think I'm going to do more good by talking about abortion with people, because I can change people's minds on bodily rights in 5 minutes flat if they're open-minded. And I've done it. And so, like, that time is like, well, that's efficient, valuable time. Whereas in order to even like take some meager shot at changing the skeptic, it's going to take a long time. So at a time level, it's not the most valuable. And so that's where the role of, okay, is it a really busy day at Outreach? Do I have to take that into consideration? Or is like, we happen to come here on spring break unintentionally, and the campus is deserted, and the only guy that wants to talk to me is this extreme skeptic. Like, I'll take my shot with him. And other times I'm just going to make a judgment call. I'm going to say, okay, I know this is kind of a dark hole to go down, but I feel like we've got rapport. I feel like he's listening to me, and maybe I can actually make a difference here. It's total judgment call territory. But when Rachel was bringing that up earlier, it's a question of, for most people, is that a direction that you should ever go? And I think I basically agree with Rachel that if you're a person that is completely not ready for this conversation, then it's even more likely that a better use of your time is talking about what you're ready to talk about, which is abortion. But on the other hand, I also want to say for that person, if the campus is deserted, like you're going to learn things talking to the skeptic. It's good to talk to people with different views. And even if you completely fall on your face and fail at persuading them, you're going to learn about the process and you're going to have a lot of good things to reflect on. Because there's still a value there, but it's a different kind of value than changing someone's mind on abortion.
So Tim, I would like to try to see if I can gather a practical tip from you.
Sure. I still haven't answered Ian's question.
Yeah,
I was going to say.
I think I'm like bringing out Ian's question a little bit. So if you're about to go into that a situation, is it helpful to like frame the conversation, do a meta conversation statement?
That's basically where I was going to start.
Okay, go ahead, go for it. I want to hear from you. Like, how do you say, okay, we're gonna go play in the sandbox now?
Yeah.
That's not hell.
So Rachel, let's say you're the skeptic.
Yeah.
Okay, so this has been really helpful. So now I think I understand why we disagree, and it's a lot more complicated than I thought it was. Like we have a really deep agreement. I like you. Like I've enjoyed our conversation. Like I don't take this personally, but we are like on different planets when it comes to how to think about the world. Wouldn't you say? Like I'm not misreading this, am I?
No, that's fair.
Yeah, we're really different, different kind of people. So I would like to try to make some headway, even though like basically we're coming into this and you only speak Greek and I only speak Arabic, and like we're just gonna try anyway because I think it's worthwhile. But I want to try to set the stage a little bit because there are certain ways we could do this discussion that I think would be unproductive. By that I don't mean screaming at each other, because like you haven't screamed at me. We've been talking for a half an hour. And I haven't screamed at you. That's not really my thing. That's not what I'm worried about. But there's a structure to having conversations about what we know that I think creates problems, which is where only like one side gets to play the interrogator. I think both of our views have flaws. Both of our systems of thinking about how we know what we know are going to have weaknesses in them. And the question isn't just whether or not one of our views has a weakness. We got to look at both sides of this and figure out, okay, which weaknesses are worse. So why don't you go first? Take some time. Help me explain what about my view you find unreasonable or even offensive. Maybe someone might think it's offensive. You take some time, but also you don't get to just leave right after that and be like, okay, well, obviously his view is unreasonable. You got to give me a fair shake too. Does that make sense? Is that fair?
Yeah, that sounds fair. Let's do that.
That's probably the way that I'd want to frame that, and try to be really friendly about it. I'm a fan of like making kind of light of like, oh my gosh, we're opposites. We live on different planets here, but hey, this is fun anyway. Like we're having a good conversation, and try and keep the like positivity up while also just acknowledging we have a giant difference here. I would do the same thing with a relativist.
So basically everything you just said, you actually just said the word. It's just acknowledging the current situation, and that kind of gets people comfortable and being able to talk about this really hard conversation. And
kind of setting the stage for where we're going.
Yeah.
Like I want them to know what to expect. In general, people are afraid of the unknown. That's why people are afraid of the dark. They don't like the unknown. And so here's what we're going to do. Here's how we're going to talk about this, but also kind of like get their permission. Don't be like, I'm the governor of the conversation. Be like, I think this is the approach we should take. Make sure they're cool with it. And now, okay, we've got a plan. And people tend to feel more comfortable.
And when you set it up like that, I think you're in less danger of it going off in a very bizarre direction, because sometimes when you're in the weeds, it's really easy to get sidetracked.
Totally
and now
true.
that you've set that up and you've kind of framed it, you're going to be able to stay in the arena that you need to be in.
Yeah. Does that answer your question, Ian?
Yeah, I think that really helps.
Okay.
Yeah, I think all that really helps that question. Yeah.
I want to know if we've answered all of Ian's questions about epistemology, because that'll be part one. Like, I'm so happy right now. Like, basically, as you were doing your first lecture, like I was like, okay, Tim's the only one talking like 20 minutes, and that means this is a two-parter. So I'm so happy because we really need to get multiple podcasts recorded today. I don't have Ian's email right in front of me, which would have been helpful. But I want us to let's tie a bow on the epistemology discussion. Have we answered all of your questions about this kind of topic, Ian? And if not, let's do that, and then we're going to end this episode.
I think we haven't fully covered it yet.
So basically, when we actually first presented the argument to our club, someone actually said to me, it really feels like we're framing it so we should give elephants more rights instead of infants. And the one thing I after thinking about it a while, my personal thought on it, and I want to hear your personal thoughts, is that the key is to framing that is to agree that we all value infants ahead of time and thus go with it. Because kind of presented to the club, or at least how it was presented in the videos people said, for some reason it made them feel like we were talking up elephants too much.
One possible reason why people might get that is because I spent some time in the video talking about elephants. And the reason I did that was because I was hyper aware while we were recording. And to be fair, I do this in speeches too for the same reason, is that I know a lot of pro-life people are coming to the table. Like we're making these for pro-life people. And they're coming to the table with a view that the only things that matter at all are things that are made in God's image, which are humans. And so me saying something like elephants have some value, and I would argue are self-aware, there's going to be this automatic pushback. I have just said a thing that a lot of pro-life people have not thought about before and are going to like instantly have this kind of instinctive reaction like, what do you mean? Elephants are humans, so they can't be self-aware, like that kind of a thing. And so me kind of going into a little bit of detail, let me talk a little bit about why I think elephants are self-aware. But originally we were talking about gorillas. Like I used to talk about Coco the gorilla as the example, and we stopped.
That was the original third example in the zoo shooting experiment.
And I feel like we all stopped doing that just because gorillas are so confusing, you know? And so we purposely picked elephant to go with something that seems less like a person to a lot of people. We're trying to go with something a little bit more removed from humans than gorillas are, but still something that's self-aware. We're purposely picking an example. We want in the thought experiment for it to be something where elephants are in and newborns are out. And so because elephants are self-aware, and I think pretty obviously not persons, they seemed like a really convenient example. But I felt like we're coming to this, you know, like there's a reason we think elephants are self-aware is because we have some knowledge about elephants that most people just don't have. So quickly explaining, here's this interesting thing about elephants. They can pass the mirror test. They mourn their dead in interesting ways. It's like just like background information. But I wonder if maybe just because I'm spending like some time talking about that, if then it feels like I'm highlighting elephants in a way above like infants, which I'm like, the infants are obvious.
Yeah, I think that's probably part of it. And I also wonder if part of it is like all three of the ERI staff members on this call have some level of sympathy with animal rights groups.
Yeah.
Like none of us are part of PETA. We don't think that squirrels are people. Like hang in there with me here. But like Josh and I we both had some experiences at zoos and thinking through, okay, like what do we think about this thing? We've talked about that a little bit, and a lot of other conversations. And I think there's also a natural dynamic with thinking about the kinds of things that these animals can do starts to make you feel more sympathetic towards them.
Right.
And I think in a good way, not in a bad way. There's a bad way to do this, which is to humanize too much and be like, the chicken in the sandwich that you're eating had feelings and a name, and like chickens are definitely farther removed. But to say that chimps should get humane treatment, I think that's basically true. And there's a tribalism, like reactionary thing that happens here that I think conservatives are particularly vulnerable to in this discussion, which is, well, we don't like the left. We don't like people that are like extreme animal rights people. So it's like, fine, just shoot a dolphin. Who cares? Kind of like as a reaction. And people do that kind of thing on both sides. Like, kill all the fetuses. Everyone does this. And I think it's actually problematic. I think there's a similar dynamic with environment stuff. So my view on the environment, like I'm not an extreme environment person. We got to protect the environment at all costs person. But I do think like I'm wary of the overreaction of like, okay, we're frustrated with all of these extreme regulations that are going to be really harmful. And so, let's just throw acid in the river. not that people actually do that. That's not what I'm saying. But like, there's like an attitude of like, screw the environment.
Right.
Like that kind of thing. I think that's problematic. And so I think what we've all kind of experienced as we spent time thinking through the equal rights argument and animals is I think an experience of becoming a little more balanced and appropriately sympathetic. The fact that elephants mourn their dead and they've got some level of awareness, like we should think about that. I'm not saying they're persons. Again, stay with me. But I think that where we are, which is a little more sympathetic, is actually balanced and appropriate.
Because we're looking down the criteria of possible things that can ordain personhood. Maybe it's that some animal rights activists see pain as something that when they see an organism or an animal feels pain, maybe that's why. So when he said eating the chicken sandwich, the chick, it had a name, it could feel. And we know that we can feel pain. So we're kind of like imposing our head and how we feel pain onto the chicken. And maybe that's one reason that a lot of animal rights activists, is that something you would agree with? That's pretty common, or?
I think that's absolutely true. I think it's a huge part of why people wind up with these kinds of extreme views is because It's not just chimps that are able to feel pain. Squirrels react to pain too. And so like, oh man, like maybe if pain is the thing, then squirrels would be in. That doesn't seem like that fits our general intuitions. Doesn't mean that that intuition is 100% foolproof. It's not. But it's a pretty extreme jump to say that intuition is so faulty that if you run over a squirrel in the street, that's just as bad as if you run over a toddler. And I think most people kind of recognize that. But I think your analysis is a really good one. It comes from empathy and, okay, they can feel pain, and so this should be the thing.
I think sometimes when you're going through the alternative explanations of the equal rights argument and you're exploring different things that could be what grants you access to the equal rights circle, and you go through intelligence or even like complexity of the organism, I think sometimes it is going to lead people to have a deeper appreciation for elephants or dolphins or something else. And I think that's a good thing. But I think that if we are exploring these alternative explanations, and now it seems like this human person who is mentally incapacitated or an infant or whatever else, and they don't have this complexity of thought yet. And so we're devaluing them and we're putting up in value a adult elephant or something. I think that this can expose some of the moral problems that we have in today's world. I think oftentimes either we're making a mistake of thinking humans are lower than they are and they're just another kind of mammal, or we're thinking that they're higher than they are, and that's a whole nother theological discussion. But I think that sometimes it's good that when we're thinking through complex philosophy for the first time, we're thinking through moral problems for the first time. A lot of people are encountering that when they have an abortion discussion, because philosophy isn't taught in schools anymore. And, you know, we're valuing the hard sciences over the value we used to put on the humanities. And I think that the humanities teach moral lessons and they teach complex thinking and critical thinking. And so there's a bigger problem that can be exposed by something very specific like this discussion.
Just as a pragmatic point, this is similar to a point that I've made before, where I'm looking for, like, at a pragmatic level, rhetorically really helpful things to say on college campuses. And I'll just say it like this thing where when we made the course and when I give speeches, like, we have in our head, okay, some conservatives kind of have this reactive screw animals kind of an attitude, but like they have that thing going on. We know that. And so we responded by like that affected some of the things that I said on the course. But then also a lot of leftists are expecting that from all conservatives and pro-lifers. And so when I'm on a college campus and I spend a little bit of time explaining why I think it's really wrong to kill elephants, or why, or like how the documentaries The Cove and Blackfish both really affected the way that I think about dolphins and orcas and the way that they ought to be treated. Like, me just taking a minute and just explaining that with some feeling, like, you know, with some emotion, it gives them such a, like, an insight into, like, okay, again, like, I'm trying to uncaricature myself. They have like a false view of me, assuming they are assuming anything about me. And I'm kind of taking myself out of that and showing, okay, I have thought about this. We have more common ground than you think. And given that I have, like, hopefully the implication, or I might just have to say it, like, given that I have thought about, you know, elephants passing the mirror test and dolphins and orcas and chimps, like, I've put, like, it doesn't mean I'm done thinking about those topics, but I have put some thought into it. I still think humans are more valuable. Like, maybe they ought to be more curious about how I got to that conclusion than if they're thinking I've just got this, like, really simplistic view of, like, humans good, animals bad. Like there's more to it going on for me.
You're describing an intentional, selfless virtue signal.
Yes.
I guess exactly what's happening here. And so if you haven't listened to our podcast on virtue signaling, you should do that.
Or read Tim's article.
Or read the article.
Okay, I'll be doing that. Personal recommendation. I want to do that now. Yeah. I think I answered a set of questions. So.
Okay, so that's a wrap on part 1. So we'll come back next time and we'll answer Ian's other questions.